Good afternoon. Maybe a little louder. Good afternoon. For our audiences who are live stream. So welcome to the 17th Annual MLK Lecture here at Brown University. My name is Lisa Cariagalo, and I am the Associate Provost for Academic Development and Diversity here at Brown. We are honored to have special guests present here from the Providence community and our guests who are watching online. I would like to also give special thanks to Professor Tricia Rose, Director of the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America, and Professor Michael Steinberg, Director of the Kogut Center for the Humanities, for inspiring and bringing to fruition the opportunity to host our keynote speaker. I want to also especially acknowledge the many faculty and students at Tougaloo College who are watching this from live stream this afternoon. We extend our profound gratitude to the president of Tougaloo, Dr. Beverly Wade Hogan, and Provost Dr. Betty Parker Smith for their commitment to sustaining the Brown-Tougaloo partnership. This remarkable partnership is celebrating this year its 50th anniversary. More to come about that shortly. Today we honor Dr. King's legacy. Guided by our distinguished keynote speaker, we shall collectively remember the past, what it was like for Dr. King and the other civil rights leaders and the students of SNCC in 1964, 50 years ago, as they moved towards Freedom Summer and the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This remembrance and recalling of this history must and should animate our conversations and our efforts today to address issues of access, equity, and justice. That we continue still to wage the war on poverty here in this country, particularly on behalf of our most vulnerable populations. Over 16 million children in our country live in poverty today. That is nearly 1 in 5 children. Much remains to be done. I had the great pleasure last night at the Rhode Island School of Design's annual Martin Luther King Lecture to hear from the great Marian Wright Edelman, founder and president of the Children's Defense Fund, who herself was a critical presence in Mississippi during Freedom Summer. She said, quote, "A lot of people are waiting for a Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi to come back, but they are gone. We are it. It is up to us. It is up to you." Before our keynote speaker is introduced, I would like to introduce to you an incredibly talented group of Brown students. Shades of Brown was founded in 1986 by a group of African-American students. They are a multicultural, multi-ethnic, co-ed musical performance group that performs songs rooted in the African-American tradition, such as funk, hip-hop, gospel, R&B, and soul. They also sing in several different languages, such as Swahili, Zulu, and Spanish. Shades performs both a cappella as well as with a live band in order to explore the diversity that exists within peoples of the African diaspora, both on the continent and across the Americas. Shades of Brown.
Good afternoon. We're honored to be here to perform for you. Our first song is appropriately named MLK, and it is one interpretation of Dr. King's dream. Sleep, sleep tonight, and may your dreams be realized. If the thundercloud passes rain, so let it rain, rain down on here. So let it be.
To introduce our keynote speaker, we will have the Provost of Brown University, Dr. Schlissel, here at the podium. Dr. Schlissel was named Provost of Brown University in July 2011. As Brown's Chief Academic Officer, he is responsible for all academic, programmatic, and budgetary functions within the college, the graduate school, the School of Medicine, and the School of Engineering, as well as the libraries, research institutes, and centers at Brown. He received his undergraduate degree at Princeton University and earned both his MD and PhD at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. Dr. Schlissel began his career as a faculty member at Johns Hopkins University and then moved to the Department of Molecular and Cell Biology at the University of California at Berkeley. He subsequently became UC Berkeley's Dean of Biological Sciences in the College of Letters and Science and held this post until his appointment as Brown's Provost. He was elected to the American Society of Clinical Investigators in 1998 and the American Association of Physicians, as well as a Fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 2013. Sad for us, but incredibly a wonderful honor for him. Provost Mark Schlissel, this past Friday, was named the new president of the University of Michigan. Provost Schlissel.
So hi, everybody, and thank you very much, Lisa. I've never had a longer introduction to introduce a speaker before, so it is really very kind. I'd like to welcome you all to the 17th Martin Luther King Jr. Lectureship at Brown University. It's also a pleasure for me to welcome those who are watching this streaming video, especially at our sister institution in Tougaloo. The year 2014 marks the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That act is our nation's benchmark civil rights legislation, and it continues to resonate to today in America. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It personally amazes me that in a country with our Constitution and Bill of Rights, such legislation was even necessary. However, the passage of the act ended the application of Jim Crow laws, which had been upheld by the Supreme Court in its 1896 case, Plessy v. Ferguson, in which the Supreme Court held that racial segregation purported to be separate but equal was nonetheless constitutional. The Civil Rights Act, was eventually expanded by Congress to strengthen enforcement of these fundamental civil rights. It's part of the broader legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. On July the 2nd, 1964, when President Johnson signed the legislation into law, Dr. King was standing directly behind him. Our distinguished speaker today gives us unique insights, not just into the life of Dr. King, but also into the larger circumstances of the civil rights movement. Distinguished and long-serving Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton from the District of Columbia wrote in a book review that the work of our speaker, quote, is right out of the pages of our lives, compelling portraits placed in the excitement of a period when oppressed and powerless people, moving together, changed themselves and their country profoundly and permanently. Taylor Branch is an American author and public speaker. He's best known for his landmark narrative history of the civil rights era, America in the King Years. The trilogy's first volume, Parting the Waters, won the Pulitzer Prize for History and numerous other awards in 1989. I was speaking about this work earlier today with one of our faculty colleagues, and she told me it actually made her cry. 2 volumes, Pillar of Fire and At Canaan's Edge, completed the trilogy some time ago. Mr. Branch returned to civil rights history for his latest book, The King Years, Historic Moments in the Civil Rights Movement. It represents 18 key episodes across the era, selected and knitted together with new introductory material. And actually, that book will be available during a reception afterwards, and maybe we could even convince its author to sign a few copies for us. Mr. Branch is also the author of The Clinton Tapes, Wrestling History with the President. Taylor Branch began his career in 1970 as a staff journalist with Washington Monthly, Harper's, and Esquire. He holds honorary doctorates from 10 colleges and universities. Other honors include the Dayton Literary Prize for Lifetime Achievement and the MacArthur Foundation Genius Grant, also the National Humanities Medal in 1999. He earned his bachelor's degree from the UNC Chapel Hill, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a master's from the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University. I'm delighted to welcome Mr. Taylor Branch to Brown. He'll also be participating in discussions after the talk and also tomorrow at a meeting, is it at Kogut, I believe. So welcome, Taylor Branch to Brown University. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Provost Schlissel, or should I say President. Congratulations. We were saying both of my children went to the University of Michigan. So I've spent a lot of time at Ann Arbor, and you have a great adventure ahead of you. I want to thank Brown for having me here. I want to thank the young lady who's working so hard to type over here. I can't imagine that job, but I want to thank you. I want to thank the people at Tougaloo who may be watching this. I've spent many, many hours in the library there and interviewing your alumni who were heroes in the civil rights movement, the late Lawrence Guillot, Dorian, and Joyce Ladner, among many others, Reverend Ed King at Tougaloo. So I'm happy that some of you may be tuning in as well. This is an auspicious occasion, 50 years since the '64 Civil Rights Act, and I want to talk to you about why I think it is so broadly diminished in public appreciation for the degree of change. You're celebrating your 250th anniversary. If you divide that in 50-year spans, this is the first one in which Brown University looks radically different from the way it looked in each of the previous 4 50-year celebrations. 50 years ago in 1964, this was still a gentleman's club with an attached young ladies' school. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 abolished legal segregation in the South. Why should it have such a profound impact on an institution like Brown that had no legal segregation of the races? And if so, what does that mean, and why do we or do we not appreciate it? About 10 days ago, I was in Boston at a presentation. My new book is dedicated to students of freedom and teachers of history. And I was at a teachers forum with Bob Moses, a SNCC leader, the father of Freedom Summer. We were talking to students. And one of the teachers stood up and said to the two of us that he taught in a high school in Boston, mixed students, black and white, that the white students said they weren't interested in civil rights because it was primarily for black people, and the black students said they weren't interested in civil rights because it was about quaint practices with water fountains in the South from long ago. Moses argued that civil rights is about the future, not about the past, and that every single person sitting in the room stood on the shoulders of people from the 1960s that they probably didn't know, who opened stubborn gates to freedom for themselves and for everyone else by the sheer breadth of their appreciation for what citizenship and freedom means in this unique country, that we have a unique concept of the responsibility for citizenship that is often lost. Moses then, as he and I, it's very strange. Independently, we have come in some of our public lectures lately to recite the Preamble to the Constitution, urging every student to be able to do that. It's very short, but it is incredibly optimistic, not only forming a more perfect union and establishing justice, but right on down to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. In order to do these things, we ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. All this is done in the names of we, the people, an extraordinary responsibility that young black people who couldn't read and write and were denied the right to vote took very seriously enough to investigate it down into its roots. I'm here to tell you why I think an appreciation for that power of change that is commonly suppressed in our culture is vital for our future and not for the past, that King Day is about the future, that the proper way to celebrate the King Day is not is not to go to the mall and take a day off, or even to go work in a soup kitchen, but to do something that takes you beyond the common boundaries of your comfort and your cultural milieu, to take a step into the unknown in the footsteps of every person from the civil rights era who contemplated going to jail and risking their whole future and their family's future. Most of them were first-generation college students, risking the hopes and dreams of their family, all reaching out in the faith that is a civic faith as well as a spiritual faith, that their acts would create some sort of bond across the boundaries that divided them. Profoundly patriotic, profoundly spiritual and religious at the same time, but also right from the heart of American history. And much of it is, I don't want to say suppressed. Suppressed is not the right word. But we are so nervous about these subjects that we tend to bounce off of them, which is why racial history is such a tricky subject for Americans. That I, in the South, was taught growing up that the Civil War had nothing to do with slavery and that slaves were better off here than they had been in Africa. But President Kennedy said on the tapes that you can listen to up at the Kennedy Library that at Harvard he was taught in the 1930s that the people who restored white rule after Reconstruction and ended Reconstruction were officially classified as the Redeemers, a religious term. That was still true at Harvard. The power of race is that people can interpret history to their own comfort, and that power has the power to turn it upside down. I believe that we have spent the past 50 years in our contemporary politics trying to turn the meaning of the advances in freedom in the 1960s upside down, or at least to deny and diminish them, and to diminish our confidence in the power of government and citizenship to address similarly difficult issues ahead, that we have crippled ourselves because we are still imprisoned by myths and misconceptions about the nature of racial politics and American citizenship. Now, let me start at the beginning a little bit. Why should you be listening to something this broad about race from a white person who grew up in segregated Atlanta in the 1950s, who was not even interested in politics? My father was a dry cleaner who raised 6 children with one rule, that anyone interested in politics cannot find honest work. He believed work was the solution for everything. But all of his employees were black in those days, and they were my supervisors from the time I went to work in the laundry at the age of 5 in the early 1950s. The cleaner's name was Peter Mitchell, and he arrived every morning just after my dad, about 6 in the morning, and Dad would take me to work. Peter wore a 3-piece suit and probably $50 shoes then, which is like $250 shoes today, and said that the only safe way for a black man to get across the city of Atlanta before dawn was to dress like he was going to meet the Queen of England. I had no idea what that meant at the time, but I did know that my dad and Peter had an incredible relationship built around a unique capacity to remember and tell jokes. And they played jokes on one another. I laugh at jokes, but they go right out of my head. They remembered all of them, and they had constant banter organized around their daily bet on the outcome of our local baseball game. Believe it or not, our team was called the Atlanta in Atlanta. And if you think that's funny, the Negro League team was the Atlanta Black Crackers. You can go look it up. My dad and Peter had a daily bet on the Crackers game. Of course, my dad was for the Crackers and Peter was against them. And we would go to the games occasionally when I was a little boy. And I still have memories that they would banter all the way down to Ponce de Leon Ballpark and be telling jokes. And then it would begin to die down as we parked. And we usually went in the laundry truck. And right down to silence as they made arrangements how to get together after the game because Peter had to go sit in the colored section. My dad, 2 or 3 times before I was 8 or 9 years old, said one sentence walking after Peter had departed. He said, "I don't like this." That's all he said. I knew it wasn't a political statement. He had no political ambition to do anything about segregation, no interest in politics, no ambition to do anything about this situation any more than he would have thought to change the weather or abolish poverty. He didn't think about it in that way. I took it to mean that he simply didn't like the fact that he couldn't keep telling jokes with Peter. But I also knew, even at that young age with no instruction, that this was a radioactive subject, and I was not to ask one question about why he didn't like this and what it meant and what he was talking about. That was the nature of the race issue in the South when I was growing up. It was fearful to everyone. Most black people today who tell you that they were in the heart of the civil rights movement are lying. Eleanor, and I love Eleanor Norton, and I love that review even more. But the notion that a whole united people rose up and achieved this change is somewhat fanciful. It was a minority of a minority that it was at one another's throats constantly in internal conflict about what to do next. It was very, very fearful. Peter died of bone cancer. So did my father. In the dry cleaning business, they were working with carcinogens. Before I was 10, my dad took me to the funeral. It was the first time I'd ever been in a black church. We were the only two white people there. And it was a memorable experience for me. I can guarantee you that. It seemed like an awful lot of people were having heart attacks, one after another. And every time they'd have a heart attack, these ladies in white uniforms with big green sashes would come running down the aisle and carry them out. And there was quite a lot of commotion going on. And then the minister said, "I see Mr. Branch is here. Would he like to come say anything?" And I was stupefied. It's the only public speech I ever saw my father give. He's very, very private. He's a businessman. And he got up in the pulpit and started telling jokes about Peter and completely broke down in the pulpit. And if you're young and you see your father break down, it's a very, very rare thing. And it began to make me wonder, as I got a little bit older, what was the power of this race thing that would have my father that involved with somebody whose home we had never been to. There was an intimacy and a division at that era that was the heart of what race was to me. And of course, this is at the very same time that black crossover music in the 1950s was beginning to mesmerize everyone in the South. Some of the nastiest white people I knew were the same ones that would take their parents' cars and go down to Herndon Stadium to hear Ray Charles, or go to the Royal Peacock to hear Jackie Wilson and Sam Cooke. We were young white Southerners who believed deeply that we were destined to grow up and wear neckties and use $2 words, $3 words, but we believed that black people had the keys to the human heart in their music, and we wouldn't listen to anybody's music that was whiter than Johnny Mathis. That was about as far as you could go. Where do these mysteries come from? Some of these were taking me over by 1964. I have a couple of Brown experiences. I got the Brown Book Award in 1964, 50 years ago. I don't know what that is and whether it still exists or not, but it came out of nowhere. By that time, I had told my family that if I ever got this civil rights issue had been beguiling me all my formative years. I was in the first grade, the year of the Brown decision. It's 1964. I'm about to start college. And still going on. I finished college the spring that Dr. King was killed. I said, I've got to, when I get really old, I was planning to be a surgeon, get really well established and wealthy and old, maybe 30, I'm going to do something about this race issue. And no sooner did I see that than I see these young girls, this was 63, mostly girls, as young as 6 years old. I have a picture in Parting in the Waters of 6-year-old girls marching into dogs and fire hoses. And it so stupefied me as to why they weren't waiting until they were successful surgeons to do this. That it was eating at me by the time I got the Brown Book Award. 4 years later, I had another Brown moment. 1 month after Dr. King was killed, in May, I was working, the Vietnam War issue had succeeded the civil rights as the obsession of the time. I was working in the Indiana primary in May of 1968, and I missed my plane out of there. I was working for Gene McCarthy, and I had to sit on my suitcase because I didn't have enough money to leave, and I was sitting next to a Pembroke student who had done the same thing, and she was having to sit on her suitcase all night. And all of a sudden, about a little after midnight, somebody tapped me on the shoulder. I turned around, and it was Robert Kennedy, who had just won the Indiana primary against McCarthy and a stand-in, the governor, for Lyndon Johnson. And he had been campaigning. It was the first time he had gone head-to-head. And he said, "Excuse me, I see you two have on McCarthy staff badges. Would you mind having breakfast with me? I want to know why McCarthy's getting the A students and I'm getting the frat boys." And we were flabbergasted, and we said, "My goodness, it's after midnight. Where could we go?" And he said, "Don't worry." He had this big, giant entourage, and to make a long story short, he opened up the Dobbs house. I don't know where the people materialized from. And he argued with us until 5:30 the next morning about the use of his name, about opportunism, every objection we had to him, every objection that he had about power, staying up all night with 2 kids instead of celebrating or collapsing and going to bed after an exhausting campaign. So that was a Brown moment. If I knew where that young lady, I've never lost track of her in the subsequent 45 years. But she was at Pembroke then, and she talked about how it was kind of part of Brown. I do remember that. The next summer, I was desperate to touch the civil rights movement because I knew that it had changed the direction of my life's interests against my will because it had lasted so long. I went south to work for Vernon Jordan in the voter education campaign, registering voters in South Georgia. By the time I was finished at the end of that summer, he had left, and I reported to John Lewis, who had become a friend of mine. So these people are still around after all this time. My assignment was to go into the tiniest counties of southwest Georgia where, after the whole civil rights movement, they didn't even have Rolodex contacts in these isolated little counties, and go into the black counties with no black registered voters and see if I could find somebody qualified and willing and brave enough to run a voter registration project. I was supposed to take 3 days flying blind into each county, drive in, find the unpaved streets, and start looking around for somebody that I could recommend. I can tell you that Columbus was not more lost when he set sail in 1492 than I was when I went into the first little county, knocked on a church door, and hoped I had found Martin Luther King. And all the preachers threw me out in every county, and so did the principals, and so did the funeral parlor owners, and I got many, many lectures on the structure of society and how they had everything under control, even though there were no black registered voters, and it was almost feudal. You could see the feudalism there. It was the era of television. To me, I'd seen the Voter Registration Act of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and you see people register on television. I assumed everybody did that. Nobody was registered in these counties. And the prisoners would come out of the jails on Saturday morning carrying the shoes of the prominent citizens that they had shined in the jail on the way to their homes to mow their lawns. And it really was almost feudal. After a time, I gave up on the established black leaders, and I was marveling, where are all the Martin Luther Kings? I tried the Stokely Carmichael rebels. My strategy there was to go out into the juke joints in the countryside and win enough money in poker games that they would start talking to me about voter registration. They didn't play poker exactly the same way we did at the Woodrow Wilson School. I didn't win very much respect, and I got arrested in a place called Bubba Doo's Big Apple outside of Cuthbert, Georgia in Randolph County. That ended my efforts to cultivate the rough crowd. Within 6 weeks or something, I would go into new counties and just walk out into boiling hot cotton fields and seek out the women in the cotton rows And I finally found in one county asking if there were matriarchs, because I kept hearing this word, you need a mama. You need a mama in this county. And there was a matriarch in Schlissel County who was probably nearly 100 years old, went almost back to the Civil War. And I was told by country directions, if you go down here to where there's a dead end and follow it to a tree and up there. And I found her house, and she was rocking on the porch. And I was explaining voter registration, and she never even acknowledged her name. I talked for at least 10 minutes. She didn't say anything. And finally, she looked at me and she said, "Son, are you sure we landed on the moon last night?" This was July of 1969. We had just landed on the moon. I said, "Yes, ma'am, I'm sure because I saw it on Walter Cronkite back at the motel." And she nodded and didn't say a word. And she went back to rocking. And so I'm trying to figure out, what is she doing here? What is going on? And I went on and started talking about voter registration again, and it seemed like an eternity went by, and her second sentence was, "Have you seen the Simoniz Wax Commercial?" And I said, "You mean the one where the little children float across the kitchen floor on an invisible shield of Simoniz wax and they don't scuff the floor because they're floating on that?" Yes, I've seen that, but... And she had me. Now I'm already all flummoxed. I'm saying that's a commercial. I believe they can make it look like the children are floating across the floor. But I saw the moon landing on a news show. So now I'm trying to talk about the difference between a news show and the Simoniz Wax Commercial. And she's only sitting there nodding. You believe that? You believe that? Like, do you believe the Simoniz Wax Commercial? You believe we landed on the moon? And this went on for half an hour, and I'm using bigger and bigger words about a 501c3 tax-exempt organization and how these grants worked and everything. And she's asking me questions about whether I've been in a fist fight. She finally said, "I can prove to you we didn't land on the moon, because if we did, all we'd have to do is fill up our tank on the moon, and on the next jump we could make it into heaven, and you know God wouldn't let us do that, so we didn't land on the moon." But even before that, I had figured out two things that she was telling me, that voting in her county went to the marrow of your bones and life and death. And at her age, she was not going to expose her people to this on the word of a 22-year-old grad student talking about 501c3 organizations. But even more, I knew that there was no way I could communicate the experience with her other than by writing it down as much as I could. And I went back to the motel and I wrote down every word she said and all my responses, and I tried to recreate it. By the end of the summer, it grew to 400 pages. I turned it in at Princeton, caused something of a stink. It was supposed to be a policy memorandum. One professor sent it off to this magazine, the Washington Monthly, which was the beginning of my career. They published it before I even knew about it. Published excerpts from this diary. First thing I'd ever written that wasn't assigned by a teacher. But it was the birth of my conviction that in race relations, and this whole summer, that in race relations we make discoveries not by our command of abstract ideas and labels, but when things are so human that those very labels get a little bit scrambled, and you can ground something in an experience that is human. And that, to be short, is how I got into this field and why my books are so long. I believe in storytelling as the way that we make discoveries about race that is broader than any section, than any race, than any section of the country. It is generally true, I would argue, that we have two kinds of racial feeling in the United States. We have down-home, fearful, southern racial feeling, not to put too fine a point on it, and we have northern scientific race feeling. The northern scientific race feeling can be traced to Louis Agassiz, whose name is all over Harvard. Louis Agassiz was brought to Charleston, South Carolina in 1842 by the great-grandfather of the reverend to whom Martin Luther King addressed the letter from Birmingham jail. And the grandfather was a liberal slave owner who had gone to Princeton and believed that slaveholders had an obligation to Christianize their slaves, and it would make them better slaves. And the more conservative slave owners were so scandalized by this idea because they were afraid that the slaves would get ideas if they had souls that could be saved. And they had access to the stories in the Bible. That they brought Agassiz over from Switzerland to argue that that black slaves were not even the same human species, and therefore you had no obligation to Christianize them. And Agassiz went up, and essentially those ideas became the basis for, later on, the American Eugenics Society and a whole hierarchy of races that was embarrassed when it developed into, centered at Cold Spring Harbor, Long Island, where my mother-in-law lives today, rescued from decades of ignominy by the discovery of DNA at the same place. We have all kinds of dodges and psychological reasons to bounce off the implications of race for our common commitment to we the people can establish justice and form a more perfect union and promote the general welfare. I'll give you one example, two. First of all, you can find this, if you're interested, the PBS NewsHour show on the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, August 28, 1963, has Gwen Ifill interviewing President Obama. I had just been on Gwen Ifill's show the day before, and you can actually it aired a day afterwards, but I'd been on the day before recording it, and she asked me what the significance of race was in contemporary politics 50 years later, and I said the biggest issue in contemporary politics is to what degree partisan gridlock has racial underpinnings and why that is never addressed. What are the underpinnings of racial gridlock, of partisan gridlock, if not racial? And she got wide-eyed at me and said, "Are you saying that gridlock is racial?" And I said, "Of course it's racial. It always has. Most of our key questions in politics have always been about race, whether it's from the Constitutional Convention on, the Three-Fifths Compromise, the Senate-House Compromise. Everything was about race then. The Civil War and on down to today, when the House of Representatives has cordoned itself off into districts which have gigantic standard deviations of difference. The average Republican district in the House of Representatives has 50% more white people than the average Democratic district. The average Democratic district has twice as many non-white constituents as the average Republican district. You think this happened by accident? This happened because the aftermath, the adjustment to the nervousness, to the challenge of what was set in motion by the 1960s was that people ingenious politicians who had been talking about race and segregation, George Wallace, one of the primary ones, he abruptly ceased talking about segregation. He never mentioned race again after 1963, almost to the day of the Birmingham church bombing, and changed his stump speech to say that he would refuse to talk about race because it was favoritism, and that his whole objective was to talk about the restoration of local government to be taken away from pointy-headed bureaucrats, tyrannical judges, and tax-and-spend legislators. He transformed a hostility across the race line into a latent hostility toward the government that had mandated these changes. Lyndon Johnson said it will move beyond George Wallace and become respectable, which it certainly has. Lyndon Johnson and Robert Kennedy are the only two politicians from that generation who were comfortable talking about race in balance. They didn't talk only about race, but they were comfortable talking about how central a challenge it was, that it was the stubborn gate to new freedom. They cooperated on a host of things, most significantly the Immigration Reform Act of 1965, which I call the third pillar of the Civil Rights era, that repealed the eugenics-based national origins exclusion for who could become a naturalized citizen. We had over 90% of the spots for legal immigrants were reserved for 3 countries, Germany, Ireland, and England. All of sub-Saharan Africa was wiped out, all of Asia, you're all the way back to the Chinese Exclusion Act. Johnson said he put Ted Kennedy in charge of it because he said, I know your family understands what it's like to be excluded as immigrants from what I hear about your father and the way the Irish were treated in Boston. I want you to work on this immigration thing. The Southerners are prostrate for about 60 days. Give me my damn immigration bill first. And he passed this and signed it at the Statue of Liberty in 1965, saying never again will the twin barriers of prejudice and privilege shadow the gate to freedom. No one is too foreign to become a fellow citizen. And that law has changed the face of America right along with the civil rights stubborn gates that have changed opportunities for women, that have taken help-wanted female ads out of the New York Times, along with help-wanted colored ads out of the Atlanta Constitution, that have opened gates for the disabled, for the environment, for a host of movements, all resting on the witness of African Americans who opened gates for everyone by plumbing the deepest meanings of we the people. The genius of Dr. King is that he put one foot in the Constitution and one foot in the Scripture. Equal souls and equal votes. You can have it either way. I'm not here to subdue the church with the government or the government with the church. They're both there. The key to both of them is nonviolence. The key to nonviolence in the spiritual side is that nonviolence is equal souls. The key to nonviolence on the secular side is democracy. What is democracy that's so unique, but a great cathedral of votes, not just for Congress and the president and every Supreme Court decision, but for Brown University and the local Providence Little League and every church and business. It runs on votes. And what is a vote but a piece of nonviolence, an agreement to settle nonviolently things that history has settled with sword and conquest? Dr. King reached very deep into our legacy of citizenship. And that, to me, is the long-range lesson of this. We have forgotten the balance that Johnson and Bobby Kennedy, I guarantee you, the overriding historical lesson that we draw today about what Bobby Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson meant is that they hated each other. Like a soap opera, which is what our modern politics has been reduced to. But you cannot go back in that history, including the Vietnam War, as fractious as that remains. There's more similarity than difference between them on every issue along the way, and every one of those landmarks, the Immigration Act, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Freedom of Information Law, a whole host of those things that we treasure today, and yet somehow say, gosh, government really ran off the rails back in that period. It's a way of refusing to acknowledge the fact that for a time, an African-American-led movement in this country served the same role as the Founding Fathers. It confronted systems of subjugation and hierarchy and figured out ways to move the whole country toward equal citizenship, which is the promise of we the people. Until we all see them as leaders, we will diminish our own history. We will diminish the legacy that we have to work with to face difficult problems in the future. That's why I think that Martin Luther King Day, that we do need to, one day we will come into better balance with our own history. It's not new that we have denied the positive implications of our own history where race comes. We did it for the Civil War. We're doing it again now. It's not new that we have bounced off the fundamental questions of violence and nonviolence as they relate to we the people. Martin Luther King said nonviolence is at the heart of we the people because it's at the heart of the vote. There is no subject more salient to young people than violence in our culture. and yet no subject for which, except possibly race, for which people bounce off to take comfort in some sort of perch, a label, a notion that protects them and ends that conversation about how much risk do you want to take for nonviolence. King said that nonviolence was a tool for every human scourge, poverty, war, and racism, violence of the flesh, and violence of the spirit. His legacy, his reach, was so far beyond race that it is a great reminder. The people who are interested in race should learn to talk about the broader implications of what happens through those stubborn gates. And people who are not interested in race and who should recognize when they bounce off of it and say, we don't need to talk about that anymore. We're in a post-racial society. Look at President Obama's answer when Gwen Ifill asked him. She threw me under the bus. She said she was going to do this. She said, the historian Taylor Branch says that partisan gridlock is racial. Do you think that's true? He danced all over creation to avoid talking about that question. Our first black president is so uncomfortable with the implications of that and the knowledge that most people, including a lot of his supporters, accept him as the first black president only on their terms of what black is, and that means not talking about your own primary personal experience. But we are still numb about race, and yet it is the gateway to understanding our American citizenship for all. That's been the lesson that has kept me enthralled from my first Atlanta Crackers games more than 50 years ago, all through an enthrallment in studying the civil rights movement, that a son of the segregated South could come to see that an African-American-led movement by people who had never really seen or felt the benefits of democracy and all of its promise could summon the discipline and the public trust, which is basically the heart of what the democratic experiment is about, the discipline of self-government, the public trust in strangers, to be able to look in the eyes of somebody who's going to beat you on the freedom rides and say, you can beat me, but I have the discipline and the faith to believe that somehow it will make some sort of human contact with our descendants that will move this country forward. That's a remarkable legacy that should not be sloughed over. I know that it is inevitable to slough over every legacy, but this one is too precious not to recognize that without it, in true proportion, our civic culture has slid towards cynicism. Cynicism is an appetite, not a judgment, and it's an appetite that rejects the great lesson of the civil rights era. It's been wonderful for me to study it. I commend it to you. For me as a white Southerner, it's a great privilege to see that this movement still has the power to lift all of us toward the better meanings of our own professed values. Thank you. Until we get the hook, I'm happy to answer questions on anything. These are broad subjects. I got a lot of them coming in here about college sports. It doesn't matter. But we're talking about race relations and democracy and Martin Luther King Day. Anything people want to ask, I think there are microphones on the side. We'll try to get through as many as we can.
Mr. Branch, thank you for the inspirational stories. This is actually a text that I received from Tougaloo College students, and this is their question. If Dr. King were alive today, what would he be working on?
Well, we know for one thing that he would be working in the context of nonviolence, which is something that makes, I want to try to put out some difficult things for you. Many veterans of the civil rights movement are embarrassed by nonviolence. It was the most powerful idea of the early civil rights movement, and yet it became passé pretty quickly. King, in marked contrast, went in exactly the opposite direction. He became more and more committed to nonviolence, even when it became unpopular. and people started rolling their eyes at "We Shall Overcome" and saying black power might do more. He said shortly toward the end of his life, if I'm the last person on earth and the last black man standing up for nonviolence, I'm going to do it. And he stood in front of his staff, which was pawing the floor in embarrassment, and said, I, Martin Luther King, take thee nonviolence to my wedded wife for as long as I have left to live. He was committed to nonviolence. I think he, of course, would have applauded what happened in Poland, the Solidarity movement, where you had essentially nonviolence went overseas and brought down the Soviet Union while all the rest of us had spent 60 years preparing for nuclear Armageddon. You know, they're singing "We Shall Overcome" at the Berlin Wall, and of course South Africa. And so I think that he would be involved with nonviolence and trying to get people to appreciate its challenges, but also its power. My guess is, and I always refuse to try to speak, more particularly what he would do, because I can't channel him. He had burned the candle at both ends. He had the heart of a 60-year-old at 39. In his autopsy, I don't know how much longer he would have lasted, but I do know that in many respects, the commitments that he was following to nonviolence have since his lifetime been more appreciated overseas than they have here in the United States, even in China. Tiananmen Square has had rebellions for 5,000 years, but Tiananmen Square was modeled on a sit-in. And it didn't win, but it hadn't been forgotten. And if and when China democratizes, it will be remembered again. So my guess is that he would have followed, and of course, Israel in the Middle East was a great heartache for him. The 1967 war is a much, much greater cultural landmark in international politics and domestic politics than we realize. The FBI wiretaps, bless the FBI every now and then, picked up Stanley Levison, Dr. King's advisor, within 10 days of the end of the Six-Day War in June 1967, telling Dr. King, this is going to be a profound challenge to us because at least half the brain power for nonviolence is Jewish, and the Jews are turning into hawks. Because a people that had existed by tolerance throughout the diaspora had all of a sudden licked 5 Arab armies in 6 days and kind of got very muscular. And he said this is going to shift culture. So I think he would have been involved with nonviolence overseas, and I don't want to get any more particular than that if he had survived. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for your remarks. A brief comment before I ask my question. Across town at 7 o'clock, we actually at Providence College will be hosting 3 freedom riders, Jean Denton Thompson, Paul Breens, and Ellen Ziskind. So it's kind of an...
I'm sorry, who's the third one?
Ellen Ziskind.
Uh-huh, thank you.
And just to mention, and it's a wonderful coincidence to be here with you. My question is, if you read Robert Carroll's latest book, another wonderful storyteller, you would think, as you mentioned, that Robert Kennedy and LBJ, just as you mentioned, hated each other. Now, you mentioned that they were very similar. Does that discount Carroll's contention that they hated each other? Did they work collaboratively together, or was just that a coincidence of their political perspectives?
Well, this is a very, very difficult issue, and I've been wrestling with Carroll's approach there because I think in many ways he's a genius, and I like what he does, but I'm not so sure on race relations that he always has it right. And I do know that it was a deliberate and tactical collaboration for the Immigration Reform Act of 1965, where he wanted to use, Ted Kennedy was a freshman senator. To make him the floor leader for a bill like that in the Judiciary Committee, and to make Robert Kennedy the spokesperson when there was already friction between them on Vietnam, that's a real act of statesmanship and political shrewdness. And I guarantee you, I never spoke to Robert Kennedy about that, but I did speak to Ted Kennedy, and he said that it was one of the great privileges of his life to be the floor leader for that bill. And he said, I knew Johnson was using me, but I didn't care because I thought this was so important, and I thought it would have such a salutary effect on the United States. And he said, it's been one of the amazements of my life ever since then that it has had all these benefits, and yet nobody talks about the fact that we now have Korean communities and communities from all over the world that people are comfortable with, or at least can be comfortable with. And we really have become a multinational, multi-ethnic democracy, and yet nobody traces that. Kennedy shrugged to me and said, I think it's because there were no demonstrations with people getting beaten over the head when we passed this bill. We really did rush in behind the momentum from the Voting Rights Act, and it sneaked up on people. So this is you're asking a very, very good and shrewd question about Johnson, about how Caro treats him, and about Robert Kennedy, and all I can say is I'm working on it. Yeah.
Mr. Branch, welcome to Providence.
Thank you.
I'm glad you made it back to Pembroke finally.
Thank you.
Perhaps one of the last daggers in the heart of separate but equal was the Boston busing crisis in the 1970s. I well understand the busing crisis, Judge Garrity's decision, the intense opposition to busing, the poor quality of the black school systems. What I don't understand is why there weren't other busing crises in other northern cities. Why didn't we see busing crises in New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, Providence? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think that you had similar crises in a lot of places. Yonkers, New York, actually came apart when the court ordered them to build even one bit of Section 8 housing on the white side of the river. There have been crises like that, but I think the Boston busing crisis was so new and novel in scale that people lost interest in it, and it was more comfortable to talk about the busing crisis in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. That happened a lot. You know, Dr. King was in Boston, not here in Boston, but up the road in Boston, within a month of his Selma speech, against the wishes of all of his staff, saying we have to take the movement to the north to show that the race issue is not and never has been purely sectional. And he went to Boston and spoke in the Commons up there, spoke to the legislature, and then started touring, because he had gone to school there. He knew Boston was a tough town, racially, tough. And, well, there's a lot of story, but I'll leave you with one story that says it all. Every Boston politician that they went to talk to wanted to talk about Selma. And it got so bad that King's staff nicknamed Elliot Richardson, who was then the Attorney General of Massachusetts, "We were with you in Selma, Richardson." And every time they would talk, they had a bet on how long it would be before Elliot Richardson would say, "We were with you in Selma," but that's because he didn't want to talk about anything in Boston. So these are things that, we talk about avoidance and race. The nature of progress in race is to do something personal that confronts that avoidance and gets more comfortable with it so you can be balanced without getting to the place that all you can talk about is race, so that you have some sort of sense of balance. Yes, ma'am.
I'm actually going to bring it back to race on that note. Thank you again for your lecture. But
could you lower the mic? It's a little hard to hear.
Sorry. When you write, as a white male in this country, how do you use your platform to support the Black freedom struggle?
When I write?
Yeah, so as a historian, writing, how do you, and writing the story of the matriarch of that town that you were telling us about, what is your perspective coming off as a white male that's maybe not from the local town?
I try to write as though I'm in the ear of every one of my readers, giving them something that is true and balanced and personal that they can live with. So I don't really see myself as an advocate, except that I think the experience has had such an effect on me that I have to have faith that it would have this similar effect on anybody else. but I don't really see myself as a political strategist when I write. And even that is somewhat controversial. Sometimes, I write narrative history. I believe that narrative history and race relations is necessary because it's not all in libraries and letters. I believe cultures preserve in libraries what they're comfortable with, and we're not comfortable with race by and large, so there's no substitute for talking to people, which to some historians makes what I do journalism. I try to cite things, and I try to be accurate, and I try to use every tool and technique, right down to transcribing most of the interviews I tape so I can get familiar with how people talk as a way of evaluating whether they're likely to have said something, So there are all these, but you ultimately have to decide what's true, but in the end I try to make it personal that bears on the largest questions, questions larger than race. So that's my avocation, and I don't consider myself a crusader for the Black Power cause or any Black cause like that. But I do think that this story has the broadest and most lasting inspiration that I could hope for in a lifetime, both on the spiritual side and on the political side. Thanks. Yes, sir.
First of all, thank you for coming to talk today,
Thank
Mr.
you.
Branch. I had the pleasure of reading Parting the Waters back in high school, so I really enjoyed it.
In high
Thank you.
school?
Yeah. So thanks for the 900 pages.
Bravo! From 40-year-olds, I get complaints about how it hurt their collarbone and that sort of thing. So it's wonderful to hear a high school student.
No, my question today is, how do you feel, and how do you think, if you can, Dr. King would feel about Martin Luther King Day? It's a day that I think is typically supposed to celebrate a day of service, and I think it's interesting that not to dismiss service, because it's just as important to treat effects as it is causes, but Dr. King lived a life that involved going to jail, being wiretapped by the FBI, and pursuing uncomfortable subjects that most people would prefer you stay away from. And yet the Martin Luther King the federal government seems to want to celebrate is one who simply served in soup kitchens all day, and that helps advance this, I guess, softer image of Martin Luther King that the government feels more like happy to project onto people, and that starts to become Dr. King's legacy. So how do you feel about the way Dr. King Day is approached today, and maybe how Dr. King would feel about that?
Well, I don't know how he would feel about it, but I can tell you how I would feel about it. I'm sad that it is so diminished. Some of this is inevitable. It happens with any holiday. When you, for every historical icon, you talk about George Washington chopping down the cherry tree and that sort of thing. You're going to do that. But for Martin Luther King, so many people see the King Day as a day to be nice to black people and kind of pat people on the head, and you've solved all of those problems. It's a holiday by and for black people. And that is so far from what I think is the true impetus of it, that it's a time when black people rescued this country, and we should all take leadership from them in humility and discovery, and imitate the courage that it took to do that by taking steps across the lines that divide us. That's why when I teach this course, every one of my students, I don't care whether it's and I'm not trying to scare people, and certainly not trying to get them in trouble, but I want my students to go, if it's nothing more than go to a church of a different race or a different faith, and come back and tell people how you were treated. I want people to get comfortable stepping across lines and making discoveries and interacting with people. And I think that's what Martin Luther King Day should be, but in a patriotic context. And yes, you're absolutely right. It's diminished, but I wouldn't put it all on the government. I think our whole culture has shrunk from a deep engagement with citizenship that is needed.
Thank you, Mr. Branch.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I want to say thank you very much for coming to speak to us about this. And especially thank you for your work with Dr. Lonnie Bunch with the Smithsonian. My mother is Dr. Wendell Matthews, And she was one who desegregated schools in the South, in Virginia, and in George Wallace's region. So my sister and I have both grown up with stories of that front line, both my mother and father. So thank you for your deep analysis of this time.
Thank you.
But I wanted to ask a question that pertains to the hot topic right now, which is empathy. You said in your speech that certain African American artists, Ray Charles and others, seem to have been able to tap into the heart. And you talked about how the African American leaders were acting in a way that was deeply empathetic in terms of sacrificing the self for others and others who did not even look like them, but for just a general sense of humanity. And right now, there is a focus on the effort to engender empathy among the next generation. It's within students, within the medical field especially, and that's my area. I'm a researcher in multiple sclerosis, so I know about this effort to create more empathetic professionals. And this effort is within the UN, the WHO. It's an international effort to engender a sense of empathy. And so I wonder, given your perspective and your experience and your deep analysis of people who were so deeply empathetic, who were African American and as well as other colors, how would you, or what suggestion might you have for this next generation as to how to engender that sense of empathy and have it be instilled in one's soul in order that one will act and have one's life devoted to humanitarian work?
Well, empathy is a vehicle for discovery, right? But it's also a discipline that you have to have because, you know, most of our impulse, I'm not a brain scientist, but I'm told that most of our impulses are unconscious and they occur before we think at all. And they have to do with gender and social divisions and everything. And civilization or our education is what we do with that. Empathy is a disciplined vehicle for discovery across the lines that divide us, and we just need gender empathy is only one of many. It's a very, very vital one. I mean, I didn't talk about too many of the historical examples of what a different world we live in than existed 50 years ago on gender issues, if nothing else. Go look up Hoyt v. Florida, Supreme Court decision 1960, in which the court upheld a Florida law, because in many states it was illegal for women to serve on juries, any kind of jury. Florida passed a law that said, well, if you're a woman and you want to serve on a jury, you have to go down to the courthouse and sign an affidavit asking to be considered for jury duty and affirming that it won't interfere with your homemaking duties. Now, that's not a lot of empathy, or it's empathy in a false sense. It's not an empathy for a full human being. So, we have a long way to go. I mean, this is standard civil rights movement. We've come farther than we realize on many of these issues. I mean, the gay rights movement would have been science fiction to Dr. King. Absolutely science fiction, that we would be moving to debate gay marriage, so soon after his lifetime. The word gay wasn't even in popular usage when he was alive. And there were people who would, and now everybody, including conservatives in Congress, wants to beat up on Putin because they're 10 years behind where we are on gay rights. And with good reason, that's fine, but it conceals from ourselves how telescoped that history has been on the lessons that we first broke through with on the race issue. So I think it's a discipline. I think it's a vehicle for discovery. I don't think people get it through their navels. I think that it's hard in college and high school when there's such tendencies to clique off. I have more success on teaching Martin Luther King Day in grammar schools in first and second graders because things about where you stand in line and who's first and what's fair are universal for them, and they don't have any cliques where they tend to say, well, that clique, it's fine for them to be at the back of the line. I think college is a really good time to work on empathy discovery, on gender and a lot of other things, but it's a discipline that I think you have to build up to the point that you're a little uncomfortable if you're not a little uncomfortable. Yes, sir.
Well, thank you, sir, for being such a marvelous storyteller in the great tradition of engagement and of moral lessons to take away from this afternoon. I just wanted to make a couple of comments. I had a question in mind, but I'll suspend that so I won't talk too long. But I'm also about your age, I guess, and also born in the South. And I was raised by two mothers. One, my birth mother, a liberal northern woman, and my African-American mother with whom I maintained a lifelong relationship. And when she came to work for us, supposedly work for us, our neighbors said, for the younger people in the crowd here, that she shouldn't enter the front door because she was a laborer, a caretaker. My parents resisted and drew the enmity of the neighbors from that day forward. When I finally traveled in the South and saw chain gangs supervised by shotgun-bearing crackers, when I looked through the papers when she finally passed away and found she was an NAACP member, have Jim Vincent here from Providence NAA, and she was very active even when we lived in Maryland with the anti-lynching activities. And again, for the younger people in the crowd, you can hardly remember such things, or maybe a history book. She was herself born in Charleston. Maybe her ancestors came over on a John Brown ship from West Africa to Charleston. Her father was a free man. Her grandfather was a slave. And even as a young person myself, and we're not that old, are we? I did meet people who were still born as slaves at a very young age, but they were born as slaves. So we have a lot of connection to some horrible things in the past. So I just wanted to share those comments. I think you can understand them. I'm sure you can. And some of the younger people would then have an understanding why I went to Spelman in Atlanta and why I lived on Hunter Street, you know very well. I met Stokely Carmichael at 11 Spoonful Tea Shop, and why I met or saw Martin Luther King in the Lincoln Memorial in '63, and why I met his father, MLK Sr., in Atlanta in '66. So there's lots of history, just a sharing. You've evoked this, and I hope I didn't speak too long.
Well, I think that's called testifying. That's fine. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, thank you so much for being here today. One thing I find very inspirational in what you talked about before and as a student of history is the belief in the power of the vote, and that's what people were working for. And so going and trying to bring the vote and bring voter registration to different areas. One thing I see among my generation, and maybe this is just too many New York Times opinions articles, but that there's a rise of apathy and a decline in the voting rates today. And I'm curious if you could speak to why you think that is and what you think we can do about it.
I think that's a very good question. The power of the vote has not declined, but people don't believe in the vote as much. That is a measure of cynicism, a measure of, the most prevalent idea in national politics since Martin Luther King died is that government is bad, and it tends to win elections. Liberals can't even call themselves liberals because they're afraid they're going to have to talk about the race issue, so they call themselves progressives. A progressive is a liberal who's afraid to talk about race. So these things still happen, and conservatives who have retreated on every issue of basic freedom from segregation to gay marriage trumpet their overall system of hostility to the very process that created all the things they're in retreat from. So this is a pretty bizarre political spectrum. The Voting Rights Act We need a whole bunch of Voting Rights Act. People who support the Voting Rights Act are in danger of getting trapped in defending something that inevitably will become an anachronism. There are a whole host of questions about apportionment, about how and when we vote, about how to make every vote count and count fairly, that are being deferred or delayed by smart people. Almost we need constitutional convention like smart people to try to figure out how to move from plugging from a anti-discrimination approach to voting to one that recognizes it at the heart of our system, at least at the heart of our formal system, and tries to promote it and make it fair. I think it's a great subject for college campuses, just like I believe violence is. It's kind of neglected. What should the next Voting Rights Act look like? A positive Voting Rights Act to address all the issues that create gridlock. To me, if you could devise a system in which congressional districts in the House were the most competitive, the most democratic one that would engender and respect the voters would be one in which you tried to make the districts competitive. That is one of the few bipartisan issues. Both parties, that's the last thing they want. So they've divided them up this way, and with a lot of racial signals undermining. So the vote is, I think it's a big intellectual challenge that's kind of drifting along. And I do think that we may wake up and rue the day if the only thing people who care about the vote do is try to restore and plug holes in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. That'll be 50 years old next year. And it is worth celebrating because it was a great leap forward. But it is not a permanent, it didn't even affect the whole South, for God's sake, let alone other places. So it's not the final word on citizenship. And I hope if we have a profound wrestling with votes and the importance of the vote, you read the New York Times today, all those people coming up there testifying about how Snowden was a traitor and it impacted the ability of our government to function. That's all secret government that doesn't rely on votes. There's no we the people in those spy systems. Those spy systems presume war. War presumes hierarchy. War denies the responsibility of we the people. So there are all kinds of things that we are susceptible to that numbs our appreciation for our heritage. Ben Franklin, in the Constitutional Convention, said we have to admit that there's an inclination to kingly government in the breast of the best Republicans. We all want the person on the white horse to save us, and whether it's the spies or the army or the soldiers or whatever, we're hostage to experts, and we're hostage to spies and all kinds of things that diminish the legacy of we the people. But we the people, that legacy, which is our better legacy, depends on votes. And it's sadly underserviced today. So thanks for your question. I hope maybe we can get some workshops on the vote going forward and how to make it a more powerful instrument. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I want to thank you so much for thinking so long and hard and deeply about and eloquently about civil rights movement. As a veteran of the Mississippi Summer Project, looking forward to the 50th anniversary coming up, I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about what you think its importance was as part of the civil rights movement.
Oh, what county were you in?
I was in Vicksburg.
Vicksburg.
Yeah.
Oh, that's on the river. That's a tough area. Well, anyway, thank you for your service in Freedom Summer. That's coming up 50 years ago. An amazing event. One of the I can tell you that in studying the origins of Freedom Summer, even before you got to it, the arguments about whether to have it and what it would do are inspiring because they went so deep on so many subjects. People would stay up all night arguing over this. First of all, By that time, they had been building grassroots movements to teach sharecropper literacy and summon up the courage to go down and try to register to vote for years, and they'd had a hard time, but they built up some leadership in a largely unlettered population of leaders, and there was tremendous fear that all of this would be overshadowed if you bring in elite white college students who know how to type. And who can call daddy in Congress. There was a lot of fear over that, what it was going to do. There was also, to be honest, there was great moral reservation and debate over how ethical it was. The reason we want to bring these kids in is because we're getting beaten and arrested and jailed down here trying to do something as basic as registering to vote, and nobody cares. Because these are black folks and it doesn't make any news, but if it happens to people from Yale and Brown and Stanford who come down here, then the country will care. And of course, but is it ethical then? What we're doing is using them as scapegoats. And here we are trying to say we're willing to die but not to injure. That's the essence of nonviolence, that you're willing to die but not to kill for these ideals and the belief that you can create this. But we're scheming here to injure these elite white kids if they come down here because we know that will get the country's attention. And it certainly did the very first night of freedom. Were you in the first week's group or the second week?
I was second. I actually left home the day that the three guys were missing.
So you're starting. So in a way, this is an amazing experience he has because he arrives for the second week training to go down there, and the very first thing that happens is that some people who were trained the previous week went missing. One new trainee and two people who were staff people who had been up for the training, they drive down and go out to investigate a church, and they're dragged away, and on Sunday night they're gone. And Bob Moses has to announce to the very next group of people that this has happened. And he, within a day or two, they were missing all the way until August, but he announced to your group that the kids are dead because he was so torn up by these ethical questions that he wanted you not to naively believe that you would be safe down there because you come from you feel that you're going to be safe. Any number of people the first week said to him, I hear all these stories about how tough race relations are down there, but nobody's ever explained it the way maybe I can explain it to them. So there was a tremendous naivete, and he wanted to make sure that you didn't have that. Please go home if you're not that was an amazing time, and I'm only looking at it as a scholar. I can't imagine what you were looking at it as a participant. But Moses... yet another black person got killed while they were having one of these debates when Lewis Allen was murdered. And he had been refusing to comment, trying to get people to come to consensus. These debates went on for a long time on all these issues about whether it was ethical, whether it would be productive, whether it would injure the indigenous leadership to have this. And he refused to speak, and people got upset with him in the meetings and said, we're all waiting until this man says something because he's our prophet. Bob Moses was the Martin Luther King of this SNCC movement. And there's one funny story of when he was confronted like that in one of the meetings, a teenager jumped up and said, "That's Moses?" Because he didn't know who Moses, but he'd heard about it. He said, "I thought he'd have a beard down to the floor. He's just a little older than I am." But Moses was waiting there, and he was called away because somebody that he'd been involved in and was a witness to one murder was himself murdered, ambushed and shotgunned under his truck, Lewis Allen, January 31st, 1964, anniversary coming up 50 years ago this week. Lewis Allen was killed, and Moses comes back to the debate, which is still going on in Hattiesburg, and said, and threw his weight behind it, said, "That's it. We can't protect our own people. We have to have the summer project. What we have to do is to emphasize to those people that we're taking the same risks that we're asking them to take. That's all we can do." And I assume that's what he did with you when you went there. Anyway, thanks. It's an amazing example of American history, and my guess is that you're probably not different from every other veteran of Freedom Summer that I've talked to who says that it's an indelible experience for the rest of their lives.
Absolutely. A highlight, really, of my life.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I apologize to all of you who still have questions of Mr. Branch, but I hope that you will join us in thanking him once again for his inspiring stories and for coming to visit here and for testifying to us this afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Branch. And do please join us next door in Sales Hall. Mr. Branch will be signing books, but also answering questions over reception in the next hours or so. And before we end, I'd like to bring up once again Shades of Brown.
So we just were informed that you're also a gospel singer. This is our gospel medley, so we hope you enjoy, and thank you so much. That was such an enriching talk.